Hello everyone! In this video we are going to learn about template literals. We are going to answer questions like what is a template literal and when or why would I use one? I'm going to answer these questions in a bit more of a roundabout fashion. So if you're just looking for a quick 30-second or 2-minute explanation of template literals, this is not the video for you. Instead of just an underwhelming hello world example, we are going to work through a more real-world example together. So here is a code pen that I've put together, and I encourage you to use this so you can follow along with me. Okay, and what is our goal? What are we going to be building together? Well, in the JavaScript column, you can see we have a bit of JSON-esque data, right? We've got an array with 3 objects in it, and each object represents a pet. You can see it contains their name, their species, their favorite food, the year they were born, and a URL to a photograph. Now our goal is to use this JSON data to generate HTML that looks like this. So this is a sneak preview of the finished product of what you and I are going to be building, and we're going to use template literals to generate this entire string of HTML, including all of the looping and conditional logic that we're going to need. It might take more than just a few minutes, but it should be a lot of fun. We're going to learn a lot about template literals and really just JavaScript in general. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's begin by writing a bit of JavaScript to add a bit of HTML into this empty div. So over in the JavaScript column, you can scroll down to the very bottom, and right after this closing square bracket and semicolon, down here you can start typing and following along with me. I'm going to jump into my text editor just so there's less on the screen and it's easier to see in this video, but you can follow along in CodePen. Okay, so at the bottom of our JavaScript, let's select that empty div. So document get element by ID, and it had an ID of app. And then if we want to change its HTML, we can just say .inner HTML. Now traditionally, you might set this to equal a string of text, right? So quotes, hello, and that would output hello onto the page. However, instead of wrapping our text within quotes to create a simple string, instead let's wrap it in backticks. Using backticks like this is how we tell JavaScript we want to create a template literal. If you're looking for this character on your keyboard, it's to the left of the 1 key or right above the tab key. Anyways, the question becomes, well, what is a template literal? For now, just think of it as a string of text with superpowers. So for example, we can say, hello, 2 plus 2 equals blank, and it always will. Now, instead of the word blank here, we could hard code this to the number 4, but instead, if we want to do something dynamic, if we want to run an expression, we can just say $ curly brackets and then whatever we want. So 2 plus 2, and that will actually output 4, right? That code is actually being evaluated. So this lets us insert something dynamic within an otherwise static string of text. Now you might be thinking, big deal, who cares? This is just interpolation, and other programming languages have had this forever. And that's true, but historically, JavaScript did not have a super easy, intuitive way of achieving this. So that's the first big superpower of template literals. They let us include expressions within our strings of text. Okay, now let's move on to the next superpower. And that is that within a template literal, you are free to drop down to new lines. So as long as you're still within or before the closing backtick, we could create a paragraph, hi there, and we could create another new line, hello again. And this is nice because this is how you would traditionally write HTML, right? Each element gets its own line instead of something awkward like this. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but historically in JavaScript, with traditional strings of text, so if we were using quotes instead of backticks, you would need to escape each line break with a backslash like this. That can be awkward, and now our code doesn't look as clean. But luckily with template literals, you do not need the / escapes. Okay? Now if you add those two superpowers together, interpolation with strings and multiple lines, this creates the perfect recipe for outputting complex dynamic HTML. So we are going to use those two superpowers to create this layout together. Now that we've got these basics out of the way, let's dive back into our code and give ourselves a clean slate. So let's delete this current template literal and create a brand new one, right? So just 2 backticks. And let's finally start building our project. So let's begin with a heading level 1. And let's have it say pets. And in parentheses, we want it to say some blank number of results, right? But we don't want to hard code this to a certain number because in the future, there might be pets that get deleted from our collection or new pets could be added. So in place of a number here, let's include an expression. Remember, we just say $ curly brackets to do something dynamic. Within the curly brackets, let's begin with the name of our array. So back up at the top here, remember the array that contains all of our pet data is named pets data with a capital D. So within our curly brackets, pets data. And in JavaScript, every array has a property named length, which will return how many items live in the array. So altogether, this will output, cool, pets, 3 results. And just for styling or CSS reasons, why don't we give our opening h1 tag a class of app-title? And also, just to stay organized, why don't we drop down to a new line right in between the opening backtick and our h1, like this. And then we can also drop down to a new line right before the closing backtick. Cool, so this will give us a little bit of styling. Next up, let's include a note to ourselves. So on a new line, we can say pets will go here. And then below that, let's include our footer, right? So a paragraph element. Let's say these 99 pets were added recently. Check back soon for updates, right? And again, we don't want to hard code this to 99. We want a dynamic count of how many pets there are. So $ curly brackets. Our array is named pets data, and we're interested in the length. Okay, and let's also give this opening paragraph a class of footer just for CSS reasons. So that will output this. Now we've got our footer, we've got our header. We just need to work on the pets will go here section, right? If I look at the finished product, we need a way to loop through the array and do something once for each pet or each item in our array. Now there are many different ways of doing this, but let me show you what I think is the most elegant way. So back in our code, let's delete this pets will go here line. And let's say $ curly brackets. And if we just type the name of our array, so pets data, just that alone will output this. This is JavaScript's attempt at displaying an array of objects as a string of text. Now there are 2 main issues here that we need to solve. First, we want to remove the commas in between each object, right? Because if we look at our finished product, we don't want commas after each animal. And the other issue, obviously, is that we don't want each animal to be represented as just object. So we will solve both issues, but first, let's begin with the comma issue. How can we get rid of these commas? Well, first, we need to understand where the commas are coming from. Now, because we are within a template literal, JavaScript knows that we want to display the array as a string of text. So sort of automatically or behind the scenes, it's almost as if JavaScript is calling the toString method that belongs to every array. And this method creates a string by just smushing the items of the array together and separating them with commas. So if we want to remove the commas in between each object, we need to be more proactive. We need to acknowledge that our goal here is to return a string of text, not an array. So check this out. Right after pets data, but still within the curly brackets, let's say .join. In JavaScript, every array has access to a method named join. and it will generate a string of text based on the array, and it will use whatever you give it as the separator. So within these parentheses, we could say quotes and then maybe a dash, and that will output, if you zoom in, a string of text with dashes in between each item. And you could use whatever you want as the separator. So instead of a dash, you could include a space and then the word pizza and then a space. Right? You can do whatever you want. However, when your goal is to output HTML, a nice little tip or trick is to just use nothing as your separator. So just a quote and then not even a space, just the closing quote. Cool, so now we don't have any awkward separators between each item. But the next issue that we need to fix is that each pet is being represented as just object. This is what JavaScript returns when it tries to display an object as a string of text. So to fix this, it's almost as if we want an entirely new array, right? Instead of an array of 3 objects with different properties, ideally we would want an array with 3 strings of HTML text. And luckily for us, when you want to create or return a brand new array based on another array, well, JavaScript has a tool that does exactly that, and its name is map. So check this out. Down within our array line of code, right after pets data and right before the dot join, let's say dot map. In JavaScript, every array has access to the map method. And what does it do? Well, it doesn't directly change or alter the original array. Instead, it returns a brand new array. And then we can run join on that new array, just like we ran join on the original array, right? And that will return a nice string of text without any awkward separators. Okay, so the question at hand is, how does this map method work? How does it create a new array? Well, within these parentheses, we give map a function, and it will run that function once for each item in this original array. And each time the function runs, whatever it returns gets added to the brand new array that it's building. So it's almost like running the original array through an assembly line so that we can modify each item in it. It's hard to explain with words, so let's just see it in action. So within the map parentheses, let's create an anonymous function. So function parentheses curly brackets, and within the curly brackets we can drop down just for readability. And just for a quick test, let's return the word hello. So return quotes hello. That will output hello, hello, hello. But we don't want the items in our new array to just contain bogus text of hello. Instead, we want to base our new array off our actual pet data. So check this out. Within the parentheses of our anonymous function, if we include a parameter, so you can make up whatever name you want, you could say unicorn or pizza, or in this case, I'm going to say pet because I think that makes sense. But basically, the map method is going to pass along the current item in the original array that it's looping through into your function. So we can receive it with this parameter name, and then we can use this name within the body of our function to access this original data however we please. So for example, instead of return quotes hello, if we just say return pet, that's going to give us the awkward familiar object because the original items in our array are each an object. However, instead of returning the entire original object, what if we do this? We could just say pet.name, right? Because each object has a name property. So this will output purrs loud, barks a lot, and meows a lot. Or we could say pet.species, and that will output cat, dog, cat. But we don't want to just output one property of each animal. If we look at the finished product, we want to output an HTML div for each animal. And then we can include all of the relevant data inside that div. So back to our project, check this out. Let's do this. Instead of just returning a property, let's return a template literal. So 2 backticks, and in between the backticks, let's create a div. Let's give the opening div tag a class of animal. And within this div, let's add an image or a photograph of the animal. Just to stay organized and have traditional HTML indenting, right after the opening backtick and before the div, we could drop down to a new line. And right before the closing backtick, you could also drop down. Okay, cool. So now within this div, drop down, indent, and let's include an image element. So we want to give this a source. And this value can just pull in the photo property that each one of our animal objects contains, right? This is a path to a JPEG. So down here for the source, let's open up an expression. So $ curly brackets, and then we can just say pet.photo. And just for styling and to control the size of the photograph, on this image element, let's also give it a class of pet-photo. Okay, so all together, this will output a div for each animal with a photo inside. Next, let's add a headline with the pet's name. So right underneath this image element, let's create a heading level 2. Within it, let's output the pet's name, so $ curly brackets to run an expression. And we can just say pet.name. And how about right after that, in parentheses, we include whether it's a cat or a dog, right? So the species. So these parentheses don't have anything to do with programming. That's just how I want to display the species, right? So if we look at the finished product, you can see the name of the animal, and then in parentheses in a smaller font, it says cat. So back to our project. Let's just say $ curly brackets, pet.species. And if we want this entire parentheses area to use a smaller font and a lighter color, we can just wrap it in an HTML span. Close out the span here, and let's give that span a class of species just for the CSS. And why don't we also give the heading level 2 a class of pet-name, okay, and that will output this. Now all we have left is to output the age and the favorite foods of each animal. However, before we get to that, this highlighted part of our code is starting to look a bit messy. It's spread out across 8 lines. It's got different methods and functions, parentheses, curly brackets, a template literal. It's just a little bit overwhelming to look at, right? So let me show you how we can clean this up a bit. First, let's cut or copy this section of code into our clipboard. So begin selecting from the word return down to here and include the closing backtick. Okay, so I'm going to cut that into my clipboard. And then let's try to put this code back onto a single line. And let's just give ourselves a clean slate, and let's set the parentheses for map to be empty once again, just like this. Now this is just my personal preference, but I like my code to be set up so that each line only has one responsibility. So this way you can look through your code and immediately know what's going on. So let's set it up so that this line of code is responsible for calling map on this array and generating the new array and outputting it, but we don't need to actually store the full HTML template within this line of code. So instead, check this out. Maybe up here, right above the line that begins with document, we can say function, and let's just create a separate brand new function. We can name it whatever we want. I'm going to call it pet template, parentheses, curly brackets. And within the body of the function here, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, and then down here on the line where we call map, remember within these parentheses we give map a function, so now we can just reference our brand new function. So we can just say pet template. Now in order for these expressions to be able to actually access these properties, we need to be sure that within the parentheses for this function definition here, we include a parameter name. Now the name doesn't matter, it could be anything, but we've already coded this to use pet, so within the parentheses you could say pet, Because remember, the map method is going to pass along the current item in the array that it's looped to into this function. So this way we are receiving that data and then we can use it. So altogether, this will output the exact same result, only now our overall template is a little bit easier to read. And you could even indent these 3 lines. Cool, so we've got our header, the actual content, and our footer. Now let's finish building our pet template HTML to include the pet's age and also list out their favorite foods. In terms of displaying the age of the pet, we actually need a bit of logic in place. Because if we look at our data, all we have is a birth year. So it's up to us to calculate the current year minus the birth year and output something that makes sense. So if I look at the finished product and take barks a lot as an example, we don't just want to output the number that we calculate. We want to make it human readable, so we also want to add on text that says years old. But if the animal is only 1 year old, then we want to drop the S from the word years, right? 1 year old. Or if the animal was born in the current year, we don't want to say 0 years old. Instead, we could say something like baby. So let me show you how we can implement all of that logic. So back to our project, into our code. If we scroll down to our pet template function, right underneath this heading level 2 line, let's add a paragraph. And let's say age, colon, and then for now, I will just say blank. But this is where it would say how many years old, or baby. Before we set that up, why don't we first make age and colon bold? So we can wrap that in an HTML strong tag. And this will output this. Okay, now instead of the word blank, let's actually work on that logic. So I will delete blank and in its place create an expression. So $ curly brackets. Now I want to keep my HTML template clean and easy to read at a glance. So instead of including all of our logic right here within the template, why don't we do this? Within the curly brackets, let's just call a function named age. And this is not a magical reserved word in JavaScript. There is no native function named age. I just made that up, and now we can create a helper function with this name. So maybe right up here on a new line, let's create a brand new function. And we could name it whatever we want, but let's call it age. And for example, within this function, we could return the number 99, just as a quick example, right? So that would output age 99 for each pet. So now, instead of hard coding this to 99, let's actually calculate the age. So let's get rid of 99 and let's begin with the current year, and then we can subtract the pet's birth year from that. So in JavaScript, to get the current year, you can just create a new instance of date. This will give us a new date object, and then we can look inside that object and say dot get full year, and this method will return a traditional 4-digit year. Okay, now once we have that, we just want to subtract the birth year for the current pet. Now before we can do that, we need to make sure that this function has access to that data. So basically we want to pass the pet's birth year as an argument. So down here within our template, when we call the age function within these parentheses, let's say pet.birth year, right? That's the name of the property that each one of our 3 pet objects contains. Okay, and then within our age function, within these parentheses, let's just include a parameter. The name doesn't matter, but just to make sense, I will call it birth year. And now we can access and use that within the body of this function. So get the full year and then subtract birth year. So altogether, this will output 0 for purrs loud, 9 for barks a lot, and 5 for meows a lot. If you're watching this video in the future, and the year's no longer 2017, obviously your numbers will be different. Now at this point, let's work on the logic so that if the age is 0, we instead say baby, and if the age is 1, we say year old, and if it's anything else, we say plural years old. So how would we set that up? Well, back in our age function, instead of returning this value right away, let's delete return. Instead, let's save it as a variable. So we can make up a variable name. I will say let calculated age equal, and then our expression. Okay, now right below this, let's write an if statement. So let's say if parentheses, curly brackets. Within the parentheses, let's say if calculated age equals 1, and only if that is the case, then within these curly brackets, we can say return a string of text that says 1 year old. Okay, and then right after the closing curly bracket for this if statement, I will say else if, parentheses, curly brackets. Within these parentheses, I will say if calculated age equals 0. Only if that's the case, then I will return a string of text that says baby. And then finally, after the closing curly bracket for this else if, I will say else, curly brackets. If neither of these are true, then let's just return a template literal. So instead of quotes for a string, let's use backticks and say blank years old. Only instead of the word blank, let's include an expression. So $ curly brackets, and then we can just pull in our calculated age. Cool, so all together, this will output baby if the age is 0. We see plural years old here, cool. And if you wanted to test out the 1-year-old scenario, you could just adjust your JSON up at the very top here, and just adjust the birth year for pers loud. So for me, I will set it back to 2016, and that way I can see that yes, that works, 1 year old. No S on the year. All right, now changing gears, let's work on our final task. If we look at the finished product, we see that the only thing left is the favorite foods feature. So we've got a headline and then a bulleted list with their favorite foods. And notice that some of the pets have favorite foods, and some of them don't. So this final task is going to put everything together and really test our abilities. We're going to need conditional logic, and we're going to need to loop through an array. So jump back to our project, and back in our code, up at the top in our JavaScript, you can see the first pet object has a property named favFoods, which is an array, right? It contains 3 of their favorite foods. Barks a lot does not contain that property, but the third pet, meows a lot, does. So we need to update our pet template, this function that returns a div with a class of animal. Let's update this to output favorite foods accordingly. So underneath the paragraph that outputs their age, let's include an expression, so $ curly brackets. And in order to keep our template clean and easy to read at a glance, instead of including that header and the bulleted list directly right here, why don't we just call a function named foods? And there is no native function in JavaScript named foods, so now we need to create a function with that name. So maybe right above our pet template function, we could just say function foods, parentheses, curly brackets. And you could imagine that we would return a template literal. So backtick, and I'll drop down, and let's return a heading level 4 that says favorite foods. And then right below that, we want a bulleted list of their foods, right? So unordered list. And within that, we would have a list item for each of the foods. So just as a hard-coded test, we could say food 1 and food 2. And just for CSS or design reasons, let's give the unordered list a class of foods-list. Okay, so all together, that will give us something that looks like this. Now, obviously, we don't want to hard code this to food 1 and food 2. But before we adjust this to pull in the real data, let's first decide what we want to do if a pet object doesn't contain any favorite foods. For example, at the top of our JavaScript in our JSON data, remember that barks a lot does not contain a favorite foods array. Now, if that's the case, not only are there no list items to show, but we don't even want to display the heading level 4 favorite foods at all. So it's almost as if down in our pet template, right underneath the age text, it's almost as if we only want to run the foods function if the current pet actually has a favorite foods property. So our first instinct within this expression might be to try and write if parentheses, curly brackets, right? And say only if pet.favefoods, only if that exists, then run the foods function. However, this is not valid code. We cannot do this because an if statement is just that. It's a statement, not an expression. And within a template literal, within $curly brackets, you're only allowed to run something that's considered an expression. A really oversimplified definition of an expression is just something that's expected to return a value instead of just doing something in general. So let's delete that, and instead let me show you something that's very, very similar to an if statement, but is allowed within a template literal. We are going to use something called the ternary operator. And the syntax might seem weird or unintuitive at first, but hang in there with me. So when you want to use a ternary operator, it goes like this. First, you include a condition. I'm just writing the word condition as a placeholder, right? But you could write anything that will evaluate to either true or false. Then you include a question mark, and then you say what you want to do if the condition is true. So just as a placeholder, I will say yay. Then you include a colon, and then you say what you want to do if the condition evaluates to false. So just as a placeholder, I say nay. Again, I know this syntax looks a bit odd, but it's a very compact and useful way of adding conditional logic to a template literal. Again, this is called a ternary operator. Okay, now let's fill in these placeholders. So instead of the word condition here, let's say pet.favefoods. And we don't need to check to see if it equals something. We can literally just say pet.favefoods. And as long as it exists for the current pet object, this will evaluate to true. Okay, now if it is true, instead of yay, what do we actually want to do? We want to call our foods function. So just execute foods. And what do we want to do if this evaluates to false? If the current pet doesn't have any favorite foods? Let's just do literally nothing. So you can just include a blank set of quotes with not even a space in between them. Altogether, that will give us the favorite foods template for animals that have favorite foods, and absolutely nothing will happen for animals that don't include that. Cool. So now our absolute final task is just to pull in their actual favorite foods instead of food 1 and food 2. And we already have all of the tools needed to do that. So back in our code, within our ternary operator, when we call the foods function, let's pass it the actual favorite foods array as an argument. So within these parentheses, I will say pet.favefoods, okay? And then up within our foods function, within these parentheses, let's receive that data with a parameter. The name here does not matter, so I'm just going to say foods, and now I can use that within the body of the function. So let's hollow out this unordered list. So delete these fake list items. And within the UL tags, let's create an expression. So $curly brackets. Within the brackets, we can just say foods, right? And that alone will give us this. And now you can see how this is coming full circle. Earlier in the lesson, we already learned how to transform an array into the exact string of text that we want to generate. So right now you can see they're comma separated, wet food, comma, dry food, comma, any food. So remember our trick to remove the commas? Every array in JavaScript has access to the join method, and we can just use nothing or a completely empty pair of quotes as the separator. So that will give us this. And then if we want to transform each item in this array to include a bit of HTML around it, well, remember we learned about the map method, which lets us generate a brand new array. So check this out. Right after foods, let's say .map. Okay, and remember we give map a function. So within these parentheses, let's include an anonymous function. Function, parentheses, curly brackets. Within the curly brackets, you can drop down if you want to. And let's return a template literal, so 2 backticks. And let's create an HTML list item. And within it, we just want to pull in the current item in the array, or the current food. So within the anonymous functions parentheses, we need to include a parameter. You could say whatever you want. You could say item, or you could say food. Okay, and then we can use that parameter within the body of our function. So within the list item, let's include an expression, and then just say food. Okay, now all together, that will give us a bulleted list where each item in the array is a list item. Perfect. But before we bring this lesson to a close, I want to show you how we can use modern ES6 flavored JavaScript to clean up that syntax a bit, right? Because this chunk of code looks very messy. It's hard to look at it and immediately know what's going on. So let's clean it up a bit. First, let's convert this to use an Es6 Arrow Function. So within the parentheses for map, we can get rid of this word function here. Okay, and then right after food and the closing parenthesis, we can include an arrow symbol, which is just equal sign greater than smooshed together. Okay, next, we don't really need to drop down to a new line here. So let's put return on this same line. So just get rid of this white space. And the same thing goes here. This could sit on the same line up above it. So get rid of this white space. And if your code sits on a single line, you actually don't need the curly brackets surrounding the body of the function. So I can also get rid of this opening curly bracket and this closing curly bracket. And finally, if you don't use curly brackets, you don't need to explicitly include the word return. It's just sort of implied. So we can get rid of the word return. Cool, and now our code is a lot cleaner. Now we can just scan through our project, and when we see this line, we can immediately know what's going on. We're working with the foods array. We're using map to generate a new version of the array. This is the template for each new item in the array, and then we're joining it together. Cool. So just to prove that this code works, if I save that and refresh, we get the same desired result. And you could actually take it one step further if you wanted to. If you need to pass multiple parameters into your function, you need to include parentheses around it like this. So you could say food, comma, item, comma, pizza, however many parameters you have. However, if you only have the one single parameter, you don't need to wrap it in parentheses. So technically, we could get rid of this opening and closing set of parentheses. And if I save and refresh, we get the same result. And believe it or not, that's going to bring this lesson to a close. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel like you learned something. And if you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy my premium courses. I just launched a brand new one at the very end of October, and it's a 25-hour course to help you become a WordPress developer. Now, I know for a lot of you, WordPress is a dirty, disgusting word and you're immediately turned off, but trust me, this is a course about JavaScript as much as it is WordPress. About a year ago, WordPress finally added a REST API to its core. What does this mean to you and I as JavaScript developers? Well, it means that the platform that powers over 28% of the entire web, yes, WordPress is that popular, it means that we can now control it with JavaScript instead of everything having to be done with PHP. This brings WordPress into the 21st century and lets us flex our JavaScript muscles and build some really interactive features that are working with real WordPress data on the fly in real time. If this sounds like something you're interested in and you want to check it out, you can find a discounted coupon link, as well as links to all of my other courses, in the description for this video. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for more web development tutorials. I'll see you next time, and take care.